Good morning.
Good morning.
Isn't it a beautiful day?
Amen.
Is this the coolest place on earth to live or visit? Who's visiting? Who's living? Excellent. Well, welcome. I'm Jeff Curley. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Arrow Rock. And welcome to our first public event in Brown's Chapel since the most recent renovation. And it's a terrific facility and a very historic facility, and there's a very good reason why we're here for this Voices of Arrow Rock story. I'm going to read notes now because there's too much and I'm old and I forget stuff. So, for those of you who are not aware, the Friends of Arrow Rock has a mission to share the Missouri legacy with current and future generations. And as stewards of its history, the Friends safeguard the memories of the village by preserving buildings, artifacts, and narratives. Through exhibits, educational programs, and unique performance programs like this one, we convey the stories of the region to children and adults, grounding ourselves in the past to prepare for the future. Now, Voices of Arrow Rock, I must admit last year, I am a big fancy guy who came from California to this tiny little town. And I went to last year's Voices of Arrow Rock, and I was frankly kind of blown away. Not only by the quality of the performance, but particularly by the content and the intention of the performance. Voices is a reader's theater series that uses art to explore history and bring meaning and currency from the past to a contemporary audience. And it's a historical fiction. And this is an interesting medium, whether you've read novels of historical fiction or have seen performances. But this is a 21st century interpretation of our history based on private conversations, source documents, newspaper articles, letters, and so on, documented in these primary and secondary sources, and interpreted and brought to life for a current audience. A lot of interpretive history is sort of, I wonder what that conversation was like. I wonder how they felt about it. What were the one that's used derogatorily a lot of the time is, what were they thinking? This project is Mary here? Did Mary come? So the project was inspired in part by the work of Dr. Mary Burrell, and she's the founder of MOHEP, Missouri History and Performance Theater, the State Historical Society, and sponsored by the Friends of Arrow Rock in partnership with our friends up on the hill at the Lyceum Theater. Now, our premiere episode last year was called The Spirit of the Missouri Frontier, and it was premiered as part of the Missouri Bicentennial, and then it was performed again the following day over in Columbia at the State Historical Society. And in fact, one of the playwrights of that first voice is Brady. Where's Brady? Brady Kateman is here to observe the second installment. So thank you, Brady. Thanks for the work on the first one and for the foundation to move forward on this. And then in October, we're going to have a third installment of the series called The Heartbeat of Women, which will illuminate the story of Sophia Morel and Mary, an enslaved woman, as they share their thoughts, fears, and hopes following the October 12, 1863 Civil War skirmish that took place at Oak Grove Plantation. And this program will be performed, as this one is, but on the grounds of the plantation where it happened. Today's episode of Voices of Arrow Rock is called Crossing Barriers, and it illuminates the story of photojournalist Jim Curley as he chronicles the unlikely bond between E.L.Taylor and Herb Templeton, two retired Arrow Rock citizens of very different social and ethnic backgrounds. And we are delighted to welcome back to Arrow Rock Jim Curley. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank all the Friends of Arrow Rock, all of our members, particularly our Board of Trustees, for their support of this and our many programs and our many new initiatives that are coming up. I'd like to thank my chauffeur and friend Robert Kateman, who was nice enough to pick me up at the airport yesterday afternoon had a quick trip out to California and back. So we had a nice conversation and a really nice car. Thanks, Robert. Our performance today is dedicated to the memory of Beth Kateman Baumhorst, who served as a trustee of the Friends of Arrow Rock. And I miss her. I'd now like to introduce Beth's brother, Dr. Michael Kateman, who is the creator, creative director, and producer of Voices of E.L.Taylor. Mike.
Thank you, Jeff. Voices from the past are so very valuable. We learn from them and we are inspired by them. And I am so thankful for them. As creator and producer of Voices of Arrow Rock, I'm very thankful that you're here to share in this experience with us. I'm also thankful to the Friends of Arrow Rock trustees for sponsoring the event and also for the Arrow Rock Lyceum Theater for partnering with us in the project. And as Jeff mentioned, the inaugural episode of Voices of Arrow Rock, Spirit of the Missouri Frontier, was an official project of the Missouri 2021 Bicentennial Commemoration with performances here in Arrow Rock at the Historic Christian Church and then also at the Center for Missouri Studies in Columbia. And that performance was officially a part of the Statehood Day celebration of Missouri's bicentennial. Voices will continue through 2029, which is Arrow Rock's bicentennial. And with each new episode, we will continue to bring to life those forgotten and underrepresented voices of Arrow Rock. We'll be looking at their spirits and the times in which they lived. And to commemorate Arrow Rock's bicentennial in 2029, we'll publish an anthology of all the scripts and all of the historical data and the images that you will have in each of your programs as we move forward. Now, creating and producing a project like Voices of Arrow Rock can't be done alone. There's just no way. One has to collaborate and one has to welcome multiple voices into the process. So to all of the artists and to the advisors and to you philanthropists who've been so generous to support this, thank you for your collaboration and thank you for your voices because they've been very important in the process. We have two original Voices cast members who've returned for this episode. Chioma Anyanwu is here. You'll see her in a moment. And Pippa Letsky, who is our fiddler. So thank you, ladies, for returning. And I want to give a special thank you to cast member Ken Martinez and to Uncle Robert, who both stepped in to help me with all the things that my sister had planned to help me with in preparation for today's performance. And as we turn our sights back to 1980 for today's Voices, I also want to thank Day Kerr. We sat in her parlor at Prairie Park, I guess around a year ago, and we talked about this wonderful story of Herb and E.L. And it was back in September of 1980 when Angus McDougall's photojournalism class from the University of Missouri rolled in to Arrow Rock, and I was a senior at Marshall High School. And as a member of the Zion United Church of Christ, which is just catty-cornered right over there, I clearly remember when the editor scheduled a congregational photograph. Jim and Barb, you're in this photograph. Everybody was really excited about this photograph. And it seemed like everybody dressed up a little more for the photograph. And truth to tell, there were some people who didn't come to church very often who were in the photograph. I'm just saying. And as a fourth generation of the Kateman family who attended this church, I was just so thrilled that we were going to be a part of the book Arrow Rock, 20th Century Frontier Town. Now, little did I imagine that 42 years later, I'd be working with Jim Curley to tell E.L.Taylor and Herb Templeton's story. So thank you, Jim, for allowing us to tell your story as well. As a little boy, I hung out with my dad and Uncle Robert at Herb's shop. And I'd listen to the men tell their stories and tales. And I vividly remember the sound of chewing tobacco spittle, sizzle on the wood stove when we sat around it. But unfortunately, I don't remember the stories. I do remember Herb's kindness and always making sure that I had a Mountain Dew to drink. And this was in the days that Mountain Dew came in the green bottle, there was a hillbilly on it, and it said, Yahoo Mountain Dew. I vaguely remember E.L. However, my dad and my uncle remember him very well as a prolific storyteller. Revisiting E.L. and Herb's story as an adult reminds me of the importance of friendship. We all need connectedness. We all need understanding. And we all need support from other human beings. E.L. and Herb's story, their friendship, shows us that regardless of our backgrounds and regardless of our lived experiences, we can cross barriers to build meaningful friendships.
Frontier Town is the fifth in a series on Missouri river towns produced by photojournalism students at the University of Missouri School of Journalism under the guidance of Professor Angus McDougall. The towns of Lupus, Berger, Rhineland, Glasgow, and Arrow Rock are on the river in the middle of the state. The books show the unique character of each community. Arrow Rock is different from the rest because tourists are the lifeblood of this tiny town. Residents think in terms of 2 rather than 4 seasons, the tourists and their own. Previous Rivertown books basically were byproducts of photojournalism class field trips. Each photographer had to find her or his own story subject without having to consider its place in a documentation of the town. Later, editors would organize the photo coverage into cohesive presentations. Gathering material for this book was done more efficiently. It was a Master of Arts degree project for Marcia Joy Prouse. As an editor, she had to study the community and then decide what ought to be photographed to tell the Arrow Rock story interestingly and accurately. Patricia McDaniel had proposed her hometown as a photo project, so it was inevitable that her parents' Greek Revival home on Main Street became headquarters for Prouse's study of Arrow Rock. It was also Prouse's responsibility to document the summer tourist season activities that are central to the community's life. By the beginning of the fall semester, Prouse knew the town so well that she could name its many dogs. She decided that 20 groups of photo stories would complete the coverage, and each of McDougall's photojournalism students drew an assignment. Then, for 4 days in late September, the town's population jumped from 80 to more than 100 when the Lyceum Theater dormitory became the home for the class.
We showed up on a Friday night and set up in Brown's Chapel.
The lavatories in Brown's Chapel were used as dark rooms to develop film and make contact prints.
Well, it wasn't a very long walk from the Lyceum dorms to Brown Chapel. Kind of peaceful.
The church auditorium was used nightly for class meetings to discuss story problems and progress.
Always kind of wondered if I'd said something to someone.
Mutual friendships quickly grew between students and townspeople, and by the end of the weekend, residents talked to each other about the photographers as if they were family members. Students returned during the next several weeks to share their photos with their subjects and to complete unfinished stories. From nearly 25,000 negatives exposed by 23 photographers, about 280 photos were chosen for this book. Jim Curley, who grew up mostly in Kansas City, was one of the 23.
Marcia, our editor, got us organized, and we divided up the townspeople amongst the photojournalists. I was assigned E.L.Taylor and Buster and Henrietta Rich. E.L. lived right next door to Brown's Chapel. I walked over there after getting my assignment, and he was sitting on his porch with his dogs, Zach and Mama. He was eating a sandwich. I think it was peanut butter and jelly. Well, actually, he was giving more of the sandwich to the dogs than he was eating himself.
Prejudice is like those swarms of mosquitoes that swell up by the river in summertime. You can shoo, you can swat, you can spray, but they just keep coming back. In a small town with no highways or big buildings to separate folks, prejudice has nowhere to hide. Yes, sir. I learned at an early age that dogs are kinder than men. They really are colorblind and as loyal as, well, as dogs. They don't look down on you or call you out of your name. Old Zach and Mama loved me for no good reason, and in return, I didn't think a few bites of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich was too much to ask.
I told him about the project, and he said he'd be around. We talked for about 15 minutes, probably, and I shot a couple of pics with a small edge finder camera. As we parted, I said I was looking forward to chatting with him in the morning. He just nodded. I knocked on his door Saturday morning. No answer.
I'd been trying for 67 years to make something out of this life. I got no one left to shed any tears. So I quietly decided to die.
I went back in the afternoon and evening. Still no answer.
Someone's knocking on the door, but I can't answer anymore. It's like the old timers used to say, this earthly house is gonna soon decay, and the soul gotta find somewhere else to stay.
I tried again on Sunday morning. When he didn't answer, I thought he just changed his mind, but I always had this kind of weird feeling.
In a way, that kid Jim that kept knocking on my door reminded me of my good friend Herb that I'd met years before. I'd help out at the shop, and I did it just because. Unlike most white folks, he saw me for the man I was. Now, I must admit, I was pretty proud of my hands, the way I used them to tinker and to build. They were nimble and strong and quick. But there were too many problems in life my hands just couldn't fix.
We later found out he died over the weekend. Always kind of wondered if I'd said something to someone. I don't know.
On this side of eternity, I see it all so clear. There are things worse than death, like a life filled with regret and fear. If I could, I'd tell that young man Jim and anyone else who wanted to know, it wasn't anyone's fault. It was just time for me to go.
When we got back to campus, my editor Marcia suggested I go back to town and try to find out more about E.L. Nobody knew a lot about him. They all said he was kind of a loner, very private. People were gracious enough to let me take photos at the funeral. There were about 20 people at the service in Brown's Chapel. It was a nice service. Sad in a way, because no one seemed to know E.L. that well. No one really said that much about him, well, except for Herb Templeton. He was one of the pallbearers. Maybe the others weren't as comfortable talking to me about E.L. as Herb was. I get that.
Me and Herb made a pact that whoever died first, the other would be his pallbearer on return to dust and dirt. And on the day of my funeral, the most amazing thing I observed, I say from the great beyond, I witnessed something I thought was completely absurd. And that was a white man who actually kept his word.
Herb said E.L. was a good storyteller, someone who could spin tales together about Arrow Rock. He told me E.L. liked to trade stories. I sure wish I could have heard some of E.L.'s stories. I wonder what he would have shared. Would he have opened up to me? I would have enjoyed learning about his life. Oh, I bet I would have learned a lot from him. What tales did he spin about Arrow Rock? I still wonder. Guess I'll always wonder.
Here's one I never had a chance to tell her. Once upon a time in Arrow Rock, there lived a man named Gus, more ornery than the devil. He was a really mean old cuss. He yelled at his wife, he kicked his dog, and he drank way too much. Late one night he left the J. Houston Tavern drunk as Cootie Brown, caught one foot in the gutter and fell smack dab on the ground. And just like a cracked pecan, he busted open his head. When the sun rose the next morning, old Gus woke up dead. He said to himself, hot damn it, what in the world is that smell? It was that god-awful stench that made him realize he was in hell. Right then a black man appeared and said, hello, sir, I'm at your service and I'll show you to your room. We have 3 available. The choice is up to you. He smiled and bowed and he snickered, then said, follow me right this way. And Gus thought to himself, well, at least the darkies down here know their place. The black man showed Gus room number 1, which had a hardwood floor painted red, and everyone in that room was standing on their heads. They all looked right miserable, the entire shameful crew. Gus said, get me out of here, take me to room number 2. The black man snapped his fingers, and in an instant they arrived. Gus slowly opened the door to room number 2 to see what was inside. Again, everyone in the room stood on their heads and not their feet, except in this room the floor was a slab of hard concrete. There was a world of pain on the faces of everyone he could see. Without a pause, he said, boy, take me to room number 3. The stench he smelled before grew stronger with each step. His fingers pinched his nostrils and he tried to hold his breath. He slowly opened the door because he was unsure. Then he saw that everyone was standing upright, knee-deep in cow manure. But they each had a cup of coffee and they were chatting leisurely. So in spite of the disgusting odor, Gus chose room number 3. He trudged through all the dung towards the coffee pot. He sped. Just then the black man blew his whistle, and here's what he said. Coffee break is over, sinners. Now get back on your head.
All I had to go on to write my story was what Herb shared with me. Another photojournalist had been assigned to Herb, but after E.L.'s death, I went to see Herb. For some reason, I was surprised by the insight Herb had on their friendship. I just wasn't expecting it. I turned the tape recorder on, and Herb just started talking.
The thing of it is, in 1913, I was born in the southwest part of the county, and in 1913, E.L. was born in the southeast part of the county. Well, more east than south. Our trails didn't cross until 1972. He come here on vacation, stayed a little while, and then went back to St. Louis. The next year, he come back. We had these dogs, 2 dogs. Well, he had them with him, actually, when I met him, and he had them with him when he died. Well, in 1974, I retired, and E.L. retired, and he come here and make it his home. Now, we'd already got acquainted, so he'd come over here to the shop, took up at the shop. He was kind of a handyman. He could fix things. He was a little mechanical minded. He was electrical minded. And some things, yeah, he could fix. And I believe he could have done a lot of things in that line had he really applied himself when he was younger and really had an appetite for it.
Of course I wanted more out of life. I could have started my own business or gone into politics. But the world doesn't take too kindly to folks that happen to be mixed. I wasn't black enough for some of my family or so-called friends, and I was too black to be around white folks, so I never really fit in. It may sound like a broken record or a James Van Buren blues song, But it's hard to make it in life when there's nowhere you belong.
For a couple of years, he helped me fix up this old machinery. He worked on motors. He could do electrical wiring. He wired some things in here for me. He even put a 220 in one of my motors. But he could do those things if you could just hold him to it. Well, that last couple of years, he began to drift away. He got, lost interest, looked like. And he was his own worst enemy. He had this terrible habit, drinking, and it just got worse. And he just drifted away from me. I couldn't depend on him. He'd tell me he'd help me, and I'd tell him, tomorrow we'll do something. We'll grade the streets, or we'll fix the machinery. Next day, he wouldn't show up. Well, he'd come by in a few days later, and we'd work on whatever it was, if I hadn't already fixed it.
Well, I must admit, Herb is telling the truth. For all the things I couldn't fix, the solution was 80 proof. Just look at how the world treats a man like me. Even when I tried, all my efforts didn't amount to a hill of beans. So years ago, that old Jim Crow flew off with all my dreams.
E.L. had a hard time. He was born at a bad time, a very difficult time. He and I grew up through the same years, although we never knew one another. But in those days, black people had to sit on the back of the bus or on one side of the train car. They wasn't allowed to go to the restrooms. They wasn't allowed to go into a restaurant and eat. And they had to step off the road years ago to let the white people go by. E.L. had to try to get his schooling. They were forced to finish him a school, furnish him a schoolhouse. But it was very hard for black people just to get to school in the country. He just had a hard time getting any education, hard for him to get a job that amounted to anything. But E.L. was an intelligent man. He knew all about sports. He knew all about politics. He knew the politicians a lot better than most people. But he was his own worst enemy. He wanted to be somebody. He wanted to be important. He wanted to be noticed. He just couldn't bring himself to that standard. It seemed that this habit he had was what he fell onto. Well, that made him feel important. And it was a false feeling. I mean, his pension was good enough, and he had home, he had lights, but he just got to where he couldn't cut his own firewood. And when a man gets that far along, we can't carry out the ashes, he don't sweep the floor, he's pretty much near the end of the road. We always had it agreed that the first one of us died, the other one would be his pallbearer. It looked for a while like I was going to go first. I had this heart trouble. But he stayed with me right through it. He ran the shop sometimes. He drove me to the Veterans Hospital several times when I needed somebody. I couldn't stay awake and drive. I wasn't able. But he'd take over and he'd drive for me. He was a good friend. He was a good friend. Some days he stood me up and went away when we planned to go, but he'd always come back. And he helped me do many things. Many things. But this last summer, he just began to get so weak. He just got so weak he could hardly get around. I don't really know what the trouble was. We could never get him to go to a doctor. Everybody tried. We saw he was slipping away and needing medical attention, but he would not go. I think at the last, I think E.L. wanted to die. I think he just wanted to get away from it all. I really do believe that.
I knocked on his door Saturday morning. No answer. I went back in the afternoon and evening. Still no answer. I tried again on Sunday morning. Always kind of wondered if I'd said something to someone.
In those last weeks before my departure, I was at peace, but I understand your doubt. let me just say contentment isn't always what you have, it's also what you can live without. Sitting on my front porch with Zach, Mama, and a tasty PBJ, a spring breeze singing in the trees. Well, for me, that was a pretty good day. Now, I was in tune with the world and I had my own beliefs, but I wasn't the kind of man to wear them on my sleeve. I understood that race was a social construct and service to white supremacy. I knew about the rise of the prison industrial complex and state-sanctioned police brutality. I knew about the 1% and the racial wealth divide, evil, cultural erasure, and the truth that history books try to hide. But when I think about my parents and grandparents and my ancestors and all they had to do to survive, it truly is a miracle that I was ever even alive. I come from centuries of courage, God-given faith, and a legacy of persistence. And now I really know that my existence was an act of resistance. I kind of chuckle when I think even after death, all that I have gained, more than my fair share of those 15 minutes of fame, 41 years since my death, and y'all are still saying my name. It's really very humbling that each of you made a choice to honor my existence by listening to my voice.